Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this episode, we take a look at the what-ifs of the First World War. We explore how the war on the Western Front may have gone differently, had certain key turning points and battles taken an alternative direction. Well, hello Dan, something a little bit different in the series today because we've looked a great deal at history throughout this series. It's the essence of Not So Quiet on the Western Front, but I think you'll agree with me that one of the most fascinating things about studying military history in particular is that irresistible temptation to think what might have been. How might battles have played out differently? How might the entire war have played out differently? And so today, where we find ourselves with a little bit of time and opportunity, that's exactly what we're going to explore. Yeah,
quite exciting really, Spence. It's completely off the cuff, this one. It's not something we planned or really thought about, but of course it's always an interesting opportunity to explore avenues and rabbit holes to a certain extent that perhaps didn't come to pass, but may well have done had things played out in a slightly different way. So I think good idea today. We just take a general chronological order, throw a few ideas about. Would love to hear from you guys, of course, listening in. Let us know what you think. Did we get things right, wrong? Do you think that certain things link with others? It's just a fascinating, fairly open format podcast episode where we can have a little bit of fun and explore the possibilities of what, as we say, may have been. Where do we start, Spence? I suppose we've got to go right back to 1914 and really even pre-declaration of war. How about for you, the idea of the July crisis? And what about the resolving of the July crisis? How might that have changed things?
I think this is actually one that, surprisingly enough, hasn't really been very explored when we think about counterfactuals to do with the First World War. It's nearly always about what would have happened if this battle had gone differently. And of course, we're going to talk about that. But for me, one of the intriguing ideas about World War I is what would have actually happened if war had not broken out in July and August 1914. And in fact, this idea has been explored to an extent, in fact, by a very prominent British historian who's now based in the USA, Niall Ferguson, in a very, very epic book called Pity of War, which came out sometime from memory in the late 90s or early noughties. And his central argument in Pity of War was that the war was very futile from a British perspective, that it was a waste, that it effectively ushered in the end of Britain as a global power. And his argument was Britain had no need to get involved in this war whatsoever. And if Britain hadn't been involved in the war, Germany probably would have won. Germany would have dominated continental Europe. And memorably, he sort of painted this picture of the Germans forming a European Union in 1915 or 16, rather than obviously decades later. I have to say, not that many people bought into that idea, but quite intriguing. But I'd like to sort of take it a step further and say, well, what if the war didn't break out? And by no means was it guaranteed a war would break out in July 1914. For all the tensions in Europe, for the trigger event of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, there was still diplomatic opportunities for this to be headed off. In fact, one of the tragedies of the July crisis, a lot of European leaders are quite relaxed about it. They think, well, we've had these crises before. They always end peacefully. There's nothing much to worry about. And then, of course, it spirals out of hand. And for me, the sort of intriguing part of this is, does it mean that Europe settles down to a period of what we might call uneasy peace? And how long does it last? Or does it just actually delay the start of the war? Because there's certainly arguments that war in Europe was on the cards. There was tensions that had been growing throughout the 1900s, and it was really a matter of when, not if. Personally, though, I have a sort of sense that had the war been headed off, and no doubt the July crisis was the greatest crisis the European powers had seen up until this point, I think there could have well been a relatively prolonged period of peace. Germany's economy was growing. Germany had, in some ways, the most to lose from going to war. And although it was worried about Russian rearmament and it was worried about French revanchism, Germany was still in a strong position. Britain was in a relatively strong position. And it was in the interests of certainly both those powers to maintain peace. And so I can see a sort of intriguing future where the great imperial European powers last well into the 1920s, well into the 1930s, and perhaps there isn't a global European war if this last great crisis can be headed off. who knows what the world would have looked like if you still had these imperial powers very formally organized right into the 1930s and 40s. But what do you think, Dan? Am I being too generous to the European powers? Do you think war was always on the cards one way or another?
Well, in a sense, I want to say yes, but I think the reason I want to say yes is because the picture you've painted is just so drastically different from what actually happens. I'm finding it hard to see a Europe at peace in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, and of course later on into the 1940s. It's just so drastically different to what actually happens. But I think if we really think about it and reflect on that, I don't suppose it's a million miles away. I mean, Britain really doesn't particularly want to go to war in 1914. There's a lot on the cards. There's a lot at stake, and there's not really a huge amount to win out of the situation. Let's say even if Franz Ferdinand is assassinated, and we get this knock-on effect that we know obviously spirals out into the rest of Europe. Let's say for a second that stays fairly localized in the Balkans and in that part of the world. Yeah, maybe Britain stays out of the war. Maybe Germany doesn't feel so inclined. They're still going to struggle with that two-front war, of course, which is what they're desperately trying not to get involved in. I don't know, Spence. It's a really tricky one. So much so that I just can't picture a Europe at peace between 1914 and 1918. Maybe I'll just leave that one straight down to the listeners to make their own decision. It's such a fascinating subject. But of course, we do know that the world does go to war. Certainly Europe goes to war in 1914. And being British historians, I think we've got to start with what we will quite often claim as the greatest battle of 1914, the famous Battle of Mons, which of course is far from the greatest battle in probably every single sense, but it does have bigger ramifications in terms of Britain's involvement. And I would argue, we can mention Mons here, of course, fought in August 1914. I would argue there's a greater risk that same month, a couple of days later, just down the road, the Battle of Le Cateau in 1914, and whether if Britain had lost that battle, how differently would have things turned out?
This is I think one of the reasons why, certainly in when the battles are still in living memory, so right up until the 1980s, it's one of the reasons why Mons and Le Cateau are so strongly remembered in Britain. That there's, I think, a greater recognition that this was, in some ways, with hindsight, this was quite the moment of extreme danger for Britain and, by extension, the Allies. And what, of course, it speaks to as well is the great German gamble of 1914, the Schlieffen Plan, this all-out attempt to try and crush France within 6 weeks and then turn on Russia. And by chance, in fact, we've discussed this in our Mons episode, by chance the British Army finds itself in front of the main thrust of the Schlieffen Plan, German First Army, which is opposite it, which has to go the furthest of all the German armies. It has to go the fastest. It's the outermost arc of this multi-pronged invasion. And by chance, the British Army finds itself in the way of this invasion. And if the British at Mons or Le Cateau, because both are dangerous battles. Mons fought with both British flanks wide in the air. There's a real risk of being encircled. Le Cateau, even greater danger with half of the army isolated. Again, flanks very vulnerable. There's a chance of it being encircled and destroyed. Or even if the battle isn't fought, if the army tries to retreat straight away, probably get caught on the route and be annihilated. And I think if the British army is destroyed in 1914, in that opening week of engagements, I think two things could potentially happen. One, I think the shock in Britain is absolutely massive, a psychological shock. And crucially, there's no reinforcements coming. That army can't be replaced. It can't even be reinforced properly, really, for at least 6 weeks. So that can be largely that the British Army is discounted, it's knocked out of the order of battle. That in turn exposes French Fifth Army. It means German First Army is basically advancing unopposed through France, nothing to stop them. I think there's a very high risk in those circumstances, even though I'm sure the French would have counterattacked at the Marne. With the British Army gone, French Fifth Army's left flank completely exposed, German First Army unimpeded, I think there's every chance that von Moltke, the German commander, he holds his nerve. He's confident. He'll have known he's destroyed the British army, driven it completely to ruin, and that he doesn't lose his nerve in the Battle of the Marne. And if the Battle of the Marne in 1914 is lost, then France will fall. And if France falls, Germany wins the First World War. And so, although French listeners, and I know we have a number of those who write to us always asking a little bit more of the French perspective, although the French, I think, would have fought extremely hard, I think the loss of effectively the Allied left flank at Le Cateau the psychological blow that deals to the Allies, and the psychological boost that gives to the Germans is decisive come September 1914. And so on that decision of the 26th of August, which we have covered, listeners, back in episode 2, on that decision hangs not merely the fate of the British Army, but perhaps the entire Allied cause. I've laid out a pretty strong case there, Dan. Do you agree? Or do you have a different view?
Bold stuff indeed. It's the famous, I was thinking as you were describing that, it would be Smith Dorrien's famous phrase where he's on the phone, I think to French at the time, and there's some confusion. This is just outside Le Cateau, so post the Battle of Mons, this is the start of the Great Retreat now, where Smith Dorrien famously says, "Very well, we'll fight." And at that moment, you get Smith Dorrien is going to turn his corps. 50% of the BEF at that time are going to turn around and they're going to deal one of these counter punches, a stopping blow to the pursuing Germans, who are right hot on the heels of a very exhausted BEF. I think I agree with you, Spence. If half of the BEF is destroyed at Le Cateau, the other half under Haig, I think, is going to find itself swept up also, because remember, the fastest route round the Forêt de Montmal, the area which is actually going to be retreated through, is that dead straight Roman road on which Le Cateau lies. Let's say Le Cateau is an utter failure. It means the Germans can pour down that road and are probably going to encircle Haig as well. Haig is then going to get his force wiped out by massively superior numbers. And I think one other thing to point out here is the psychological effect, not necessarily of the Brits being knocked out, which of course would be huge, but it's the prospect for the French, at least, that the Brits are not going to be sending any more troops, because I don't think they do. Certainly not for a while. 6 weeks is too long to actually sway the battle. And whilst the BEF really is only a small extension to the much larger French army at that time, it's in a vital position and it's providing not only, a bit like the Americans we discussed recently, not necessarily big numbers at that time, but the potential for big numbers. And if you take that off the table, I agree with you, I think. It's a bold statement, but I think that is going to end the First World War perhaps in 1914, certainly in 1915. And it's not the only time that the Brits are potentially in a situation which could win or lose, or certainly could lose, the First World War. And there's another one happens really just a couple of months later. I'm going to throw at you the idea that Ypres is captured. Ypres, Wipers, depending how you want to say it, the Belgian Flemish town, which is going to be involved in a couple of close shaves, one in 1914 and then another in April 1915. What do you say to that?
I think this is a really interesting one, and it's one that has had at least some serious historical consideration. So the great British military historian, Michael Howard, military cross holder from the Second World War, British officer in the Guards, went on to be a very prominent war studies academic. When he wrote about Ypres in the 1970s, in fact, he commented, and it's always stuck with me, that if Ypres had been captured in 1914, it could have led to the Germans winning a victory worthy of Napoleon, or perhaps leading to the First World War becoming a war of Napoleonic duration. And I think he was onto something, because as we discussed in our Ypres episode, our Passchendaele episode to be precise, Ypres in 1914 is not just a symbolic city, it's a strategic city. Roads running out of Ypres go to all the major channel ports, which of course the Germans covet, and the German commander von Falkenhayn, his objective is not Ypres itself, it is these ports. And in 1914, the Germans come incredibly close to capturing Ypres. In fact, some German cavalry actually enters Ypres, loots it, and leaves. It's the last time German troops other than prisoners will actually be in Ypres, and that's in early October. But at the very end of October, in a battle I'm sure we'll cover in greater detail in a subsequent episode, the Germans actually break through the British line at the village of Gelliveld. And the road from Gelliveld to Ypres, it's about 4 miles to go, and there's effectively nothing left to stop the Germans advancing straight down that road, straight into Ypres, and thence beyond. And commander at the time of the British Army, John French, he describes it in his memoirs, which aren't always the most honest, but I think he was being honest about this. He describes that moment when he learned Gelliveld had fallen as the worst moment of his entire life. He was so shaken by this news because he knew there was nothing left in front of the German advance. But in fact, there was a last-ditch counterattack by the 2nd Worcesters, just under 500 men left out of a battalion of 1,000. They'd already suffered casualties, and against all the odds, they counterattacked at the moment the Germans seemed to have achieved victory, retook Gelliveld, and the ferocity of the counterattack and its unexpected nature turned the German advance into a pretty disorderly retreat. even though the numbers were vastly in favour of the Germans. And this was a moment that saved the British army at Gelliveld without this counterattack. And the chance of it succeeding, if you were to run it through an AI or a mathematical program, percentage-wise, must have been pretty darn low. It succeeded, it turned the tide, and although the Germans would continue to attack, they never got so close to capturing Ypres again in 1914. And I think if they'd broken through there, and they'd every chance taken Ypres, then they would have unhinged the Allied line in a very dramatic way. They'd have not only captured this really strategic road hub that could lead them elsewhere, but they'd have also broken open the Western Front. The Belgians to the north, Belgians and French to the north, they'd be in trouble. French forces to the south aren't really able to come to the aid. Germans could have prized that line open and got to the crucial channel ports, Dunkirk, Calais, maybe even Boulogne. And that is going to put the Allies under tremendous pressure, enormous danger. Belgium would have been knocked out of the war, been overrun. Serious consequences that boiled down ultimately to an afternoon of desperate fighting on the 31st of October 1914. And I think if you're looking for a single action, huge war-defining consequences, it has to be the counterattack at Gelliveld. And I think the greatest moment of danger for the loss of Ypres was 1914. But of course, it wasn't the only moment of danger, Dan, because the Germans came within a whisker of doing it again in 1915.
Yeah, it's a very good point, actually, and almost to German surprise, I would say. And I think this is perhaps the missed opportunity here because, of course, April 1915, we're going to see the second Battle of Ypres launch. This is a German assault, but it really doesn't have defined objectives, certainly not as far as the channel ports. The idea here is that chlorine gas is going to be deployed on an industrial scale for the very first time. And in effect, when this chlorine is released in April, it's going to be released against totally unprepared troops, French Algerian troops, Moroccan troops, and also latterly Canadian troops and some Brits as well. But the effect is absolutely staggering. There's, of course, no defense against it at that time. And as this cloud of chlorine is going to drift across a section of the northern part of the Ypres salient around the village of St. Julian, it's going to prise open a big old hole in the British part of the line. And what it's going to lead effectively is to a completely undefended gap, once again, where the Germans are able to, had they been organised enough, pour through, potentially capture Ypres, and then I think repeat, Spence, basically what you've just mentioned there, which is to reach the channel ports. I should add, though, I don't think, and a lot of things have to happen to get there, but yes, the war gets very difficult for the Brits, with the much shorter channel ports being knocked out, threat over the English Channel, potentially British troops then having to stay in southeast England in order to defend against that threat. It doesn't mean that there are no routes between Britain and France. There are. They're longer. They're further away. Boulogne and Le Havre, for example. Le Havre might just be far enough down. Dieppe is also far enough down. So supplies and troops could be run into there, but it's a much longer route to do so. Certainly Belgium's had it. If the Germans break through and they get to the channel ports, Belgium is absolutely lost, as are all of their troops who are fighting up around the northern part of the Western Front. The whole Western Front would have to shift dramatically. We may see a new line redrawn, but things would be desperately serious, especially at that early stage of the war. The French would have to take on far more of the burden. Absolutely. And that, who knows what could have happened if that was to eventuate. But I think the real thing to point out here is the Germans just missed that opportunity. They don't realize their new weapon is going to be as successful as it is, and as a result they don't have the troops ready to pour in. It's a diversionary assault. It's to draw away British and Canadian and French troops, and it's so successful that the Germans are really caught on the hop by their own success.
There's a what if. What if the Germans had planned it as an outright breakthrough attempt? Where they don't, they're using it really as a diversion to transfer troops for the invasion of Russia instead. Once they see how much it succeeded, then they try and redouble their efforts. But that opportunity's gone. It's a very fleeting opportunity. And in some ways, they've squandered a wonder weapon, because gas is only really a wonder weapon on those opening days. The opening 48 hours of Second Ypres, it is a wonder weapon that could potentially unlock the Western Front. And it's squandered. It's not used properly. It's not. An opportunity is lost. And the Germans, of course, come to regret that very, very deeply. And it's interesting to me that in late 15, Germans are thinking about what are we going to do in 16. Falkenhayn's looking for options about where the Germans might attack on the Western Front. We know he eventually settles on Verdun, but I think a what if that shows the importance of Ypres and the importance of the two battles we've just discussed, 1914 and 1915, is that Falkenhayn's eyes actually settle on Ypres. And he seriously considers making Ypres the centerpiece of the main German offensive of 1916, massing forces and trying to capture this town, this city that has defied him in 1914 and 1915. And he actually decides he's not going to do that because he feels the opportunity perhaps is not quite what it was. That he knows the British are going to fight tooth and nail for Ypres. They already have done, and it's going to be pretty grueling fighting. He's not entirely sure he can turn a capture of Ypres into the breakthrough that he dreamt of in 1914, 1915. And he's also not entirely sure about what happens, even if you inflict a really heavy defeat on the British. Falkenhayn has this view, well, the British will just leave. The worst that can happen to them by 16 is the British will withdraw. They might withdraw by sea, but they're going to come back because by then the British army is much bigger. And so he decides in the end to concentrate on Verdun and try and knock out the French, cause a political spasm in France and cause the French government to collapse. In the not unreasonable belief, if France collapses, well, Britain can't do a lot. Whereas if the British army is really heavily defeated, France will still fight on. But I think it's an intriguing option. And we'd be looking at an early 1916 offensive. The German army very, very strong in 1916. Many ways stronger, I think, than the British army. Do you think it could have succeeded? Might they have finally captured Ypres if there was a really big offensive there, starting, say, March 1916?
Honestly, I think it's possible. I really do. Had Verdun not taken place, because, of course, Verdun takes up a huge amount of resources, men, time, munitions, all of these kind of things. Had the effect actually been pushed onto Ypres, and the Brits, who are still trying to really find their feet, we've got the new army starting to come out, we've got tired and pretty depleted regulars, we've got territorials as well. I think it will be a tough ask for the Brits to hold on to Ypres. I really do. It's something that, of course, when we look at it and we look at the dangers that Ypres faces, we've discussed two of them, 1914, 1915. There's another one in 1918. And it shows that progress can be made around that fairly difficult terrain to fight in. But the German army gets pretty close in 1918 and had the firepower and I think amongst other things, really still the morale of the German army been as high as it was in 1916, I think the Brits could have been in pretty serious trouble. And the knock-on effect, of course, is that the French are going to be in trouble. But we need to chuck in another counterfactual here, and that we're assuming that this is happening without any response elsewhere. And I don't think that's necessarily true, because Verdun, or around the Verdun sector, if the Germans don't attack there, it's not out of the question that the French themselves will launch a diversionary attack elsewhere up and down the line. And that could have had ramifications as well. So we're going way off script here, but it's possible, right, Spence?
That's actually a great point, because, of course, in the autumn of 1915, there's been the Chantilly Conference, where the Allied powers have all agreed we're going to attack more or less simultaneously in the summer of 1916. Now, historically, Verdun disrupts that time frame, and it means that the British attack with some French support at the Somme, but not the level of French support they'd hoped. Flip the script and say the Germans attack at Ypres instead, put the BF of 1916 under really heavy pressure. There would have been intense, desperate fighting there, no doubt. If the French aren't pinned at Verdun, then presumably they're still in a position to lead a major offensive in the Somme region if they choose to attack there. And the French army, pretty formidable by 1916, certainly better at attacking than it had been the year before when it had a really awful year. And so you might get what's sometimes called a swinging door battle, with the Germans advancing in Ypres, pushing the British back, and then further south on the Somme front, the French launch a big offensive and push the Germans back as well. And what consequence there? A much bigger French offensive, a French-led battle of the Somme, which of course it was originally planned as. Well, you might get a completely different Somme. You certainly wouldn't get a 1st of July the same way that the British experience. And we only have to look at what the French do in the real 1st of July. They capture all their day one objectives. They don't take anywhere near the level of casualties as the British. And though the French are only on the right flank, really, of the British on the Somme, where they fight much more effectively. Multiply that into a huge army level offensive. Really interesting consequence. And I suppose what would boil down is, can the French put enough pressure on the Germans to detract them from Ypres before the Germans break through? And the one advantage the Germans have is they don't have anywhere near as far to go to take key objectives at Ypres as the French do at the Somme, because one of the oddities of the Somme we've discussed before is there's nothing super important behind the Somme front for quite a long way before you really start getting into strategic objectives. But I'm sure it would have inflicted a lot of damage on the Germans. So you could have ended up with a 1916 situation, historically, in reverse. The British would have defended Ypres to almost the last bayonet. They'd have refused to give any ground as much as they could. Very heavy casualties, I'm sure, would have been suffered there. But I'm sure they'd have also made the Germans bleed, and there'd have been this major offensive elsewhere. So who knows? I mean, the Germans get strained enormously in 1916 as it is by the general offensive plus Verdun. And one thing that the Germans take comfort from is they do largely hold the British on the Somme to about a 5-mile advance over several months. I think the French could have gone further than 5 miles, and that might have really raised some eyebrows at German headquarters.
Yeah, that's an interesting one to think about, actually, whether the French had led on the 1st of July 1916. But let's stay on that idea of the 1st of July. Let's assume for a moment that the 1st of July goes off as we historically know that it does. Of course, it's a disaster for the Brits in many, but not all senses. About 120,000 guys go over the top on that opening day. About 60,000 of those men, 50%, become casualties, and 19,241, if memory serves, are officially listed as being killed in action that day. Of course, a heavy blow falls on new PALS battalions, Kitchener units, also some regular and some territorial units as well. But it's an absolutely bloody fight. The first of 141 days on the Somme campaign. Now, as I think quite often when we look back at this kind of thing, Spence, there's a lot of people, and I've heard it a number of times before, where people will say, well, why did they carry on? Why did the fight continue? And I think, well, I hope in previous episodes we've discussed good reasons to why that did. But let's say for a moment, those losses are so bloody and so heavy that the British and the French are going to say, no more. Let's call it a day at the end of a very bad day on the 1st of July 1916. What do you think the ramifications of that happening are?
Well, that's a really interesting one. And I think I've said elsewhere, and I've certainly written in books I've written about this, I think in some ways, from a British perspective, strategic perspective, the most important day of the First World War could be said to be the 2nd of July, because it's had this huge blow, devastating blow on the 1st of July that it stopped the assault largely dead, apart from some advances in the south. Every reason the Germans have to suspect that's it, we've broken that offensive, nothing to worry about here. But in fact, the attacks renewed on the 2nd of July, and the fighting will continue right into November. That decision to keep going ensures the Battle of the Somme is as bloody and as long as it ultimately is, but it also completely wrenches the initiative away from the Germans. But it's by no means guarantee that this will happen. In fact, one of the reasons that it happens as it does is the British High Command is not entirely sure of the level of casualties it suffered. In fact, there have been so many casualties, they've overwhelmed effectively the medical chains, they've overwhelmed the reporting systems. It's not clear how many casualties have been suffered. There's a growing sense a lot has gone wrong. Well, the British has experienced that, sadly, in the past. But it's interesting to sort of compare and contrast what had happened just over a year earlier at the Battle of Ypres Ridge in May 1915, where the British and the Indians had actually attacked. A total disaster, about 11,500 British and Indian casualties for no ground gained. German casualties, perhaps 1,000 men, so drastically below the casualties they inflicted. And the battle's called off after one day. That's it. Though Douglas Haig, who's not the army commander, he's commanding he's the first army commander, he's not the overall commander. He'd like to carry on at Ypres Ridge, and he gets told by his subordinates, absolutely no way. And the supreme commander, Sir John French, also says, no way, you've got to pause. It's not impossible. It's unlikely, but it's not impossible that if Haig is for some reason indisposed, or perhaps he suffers a wobble, and Haig does occasionally suffer wobbles in the First World War, if he really learns the scale of damage his army has taken on the 1st of July, then he calls the assault off. Or if he faces major reaction from his corps commanders, who turn around and say, we can't do this. Our cores are smashed. There's no prospect of us going in. We've got to pause. And I think if that happens, I think this is a shot in the arm for the German war effort. As it happens, the British pressure on the Somme, combined with the fact Verdun is going wrong, leads to Falkenhayn getting replaced in the summer of 1916 by Ludendorff and Hindenburg. If Falkenhayn can turn around and go, well, we've shattered the British, and in some ways, part of the Verdun plan is based on this expectation that the British will attack to relieve Verdun and shatter themselves in the process. That's part of Falkenhayn's dream achieved. Now, that doesn't mean he's going to win at Verdun, but it does mean he's going to have far more resources to plough into Verdun than he did historically. He can, if he's defeated the British on the Somme in day one, he can go back and really put Verdun under the thumbscrews. And under those circumstances, especially if the British are so stunned they can't mount any new attack for some weeks, I think there's every chance that the tide at Verdun, which by the summer of 1916 is turning in the favour of the French, I think if the British get smashed at the Somme, there's no attack on the 2nd of July, the battle's called off, I think that the Germans can take Verdun, and what consequences that would have. And really emphasise, listeners, that's really Falkenhayn's dream scenario, and doesn't achieve it, but if he had, I think all the cards may have come up Germany.
Yeah, it's a very interesting way to look at it. I think even if the Somme goes wrong, well, of course, the Somme does go wrong. Even if the Somme gets called off after going wrong on the first day, I don't think I can see a situation where the Brits fail to attack somewhere around the line. What's possible, what's maybe conceivable, is that actually British reinforcements end up going to Verdun themselves, and we actually find British units fighting in Verdun. Other possibilities, it may be an attack further north, possibly in the Ypres salient. Maybe we get a third Battle of Ypres in 1916, another attempt to try and draw away German strength. We maybe see an assault towards Lille in that same Orbers Ridge sector, but very unfavourable ground, as Haig once famously said. But it's amazing to think, the story of the Somme, and in fact, the history of Britain and the First World War would certainly be different because we wouldn't have this very long legacy of the Battle of the Somme when we talk about this kind of thing today. But of course, the battle does go on 140 odd days, and it's going to be absolutely brutal. And by the time we get to November, the German army is absolutely shattered in that area as well. But, 1916 going into 1917, there are a lot of big opportunities and big things that could have changed the war in a huge way. And one that we've, I think, touched on inadvertently in the last few weeks, Spence, actually, when we've been talking about, of course, the story of the Doughboys, is the idea, and we have to go away from the Western Front for this one, but it's a big one. Unrestricted submarine warfare not being renewed as it was, which, of course, eventually brings America into the war.
What an intriguing what if. And it's really interesting to me. I know we're planning a U-boat episode in the future at some point. U-boat warfare and that the war at sea has always intrigued me about the First World War. And listeners, just a very quick bit of context building here. In 1915, the Germans had declared unrestricted submarine warfare, and that all ships entering British and indeed French territorial waters, whether they were neutral or they were Allied flagged, were at risk of being sunk by U-boats without any warning. There'd be no searching to see if they had contraband, no insurance for the crew. They'd just be sunk, and culminated in the notorious sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915. And the unrestricted campaign in 15 had not really had a massive military effect. Its main effect was to outrage the United States because of the sinking of the Lusitania and attacks on other passenger vessels. And what had happened there was that by 1916, the Germans had signed something called the Sussex Pledge, named after a cross-channel passenger vessel, the Sussex, which had been damaged, although not sunk by a U-boat, with a number of deaths, including injured Americans on board. And Woodrow Wilson, US president, had forced the German government, who had been clearly violating agreements not to attack passenger vessels, he forced them to sign something called the Sussex Pledge, which stated no more unrestricted submarine warfare. Fast forward, December 1916, it's the end of this really bloody year. Verdun's been lost. The French have been victorious at Verdun. The Germans have lost that battle. Battle of Somme, the German line is held, but my God, at what a cost. Possibly as many as 500,000 German casualties there. Problems in the east. The Austro-Hungarians are struggling. Everything's looking pretty grim for the Germans, and they need some way to turn the tide. And so they make this decision. We will reintroduce unrestricted submarine warfare, knowing it will bring America into the war in an attempt to starve Britain. and shatter Britain at sea, knock Britain out of the war. And the idea is that'll happen within 6 months. The Americans won't be able to mobilize in that time. Britain out of the war. France will fall victim to German armies. Now, it's accepted pretty readily, it has to be said, by the German military and body politic, because it seems to promise an answer. But if anybody had really seriously examined this plan, they'd have seen it's got serious risks. It doesn't really take into account British countermeasures. It's very dismissive of the fact the Americans are going to come into the war. There's lots of problems here. What if it had not been restarted? Well, the broad answer there is America simply wouldn't have entered the war. I think America would have continued to be a generally pro-Allied part of the war effort. They were making a lot of money selling weapons to the Allies. They weren't selling weapons to the Germans. And so it was, in some ways, it was in American finance's interest to see the Allies succeed. But I don't think that would be enough to actually sweep over and ultimately lead to America entering the war. And so if unrestricted submarine warfare isn't declared, I think two things happen. First of all, America doesn't enter the war. And that's a blow to the Allies in 1917. It's a blow psychologically because they don't get the American support, which is very important to France especially. And it's a blow financially because one thing that does happen in 1917, okay, so not a lot of American troops arrive, but America turns on its financial taps, and it's already been bankrolling the Allies up until this point to an extent. Once it's joined the war, it can bankroll them to a much, much greater extent. And that's huge, especially for Britain, which is really suffering financial strain by early 17. Without those two things, I think you could actually potentially see a situation in 1917 where, certainly by the end of 17, Germany is in a strong position. We're going to assume Russia goes into revolution. We're going to assume the French army mutinies. Passchendaele doesn't succeed. All these problems mount. At the end of 17, I think, with no America, if the Germans had put on the table a moderate peace proposal to the Western Allies at the end of 17, I think it would have been tempting, especially with Russia gone. As it so happens in the real 1917, the Allies, certain parts of the Allies, in Britain and in France, do think at the end of 17, we're never going to beat the Germans. They're just too heavily entrenched. Maybe we should do a deal. And what really adds weight to that is Russia's out the war now. The Eastern Front's closed down. About 1 million German troops are coming from east to west. Germany's going to eventually get the economic bounty from capturing all this territory. We're not going to win this. Now, it has to be said that those are dissenting voices. They're not. No, they don't have mainstream power. And the key political leaders in Britain and France, Britain, David Lloyd George, France, Georges Clemenceau, they're dedicated to fighting the war to a finish. But without the influx of American manpower and without the influx of American money and later weaponry and ammunition, I think it's going to be a much, much, much longer war. I mentioned in an American episode, I think even without the American army, I still think the Allies win. I think the economic strain in Germany, the contradictions in Germany economically cannot be overcome. Its capture of this huge portion of Russian territory is actually going to be a burden to it because this is a devastated, large portions of this is devastated. Managing it is going to be a nightmare. Extracting economic wealth from it is going to be a nightmare. And I also think Germany's allies are going to collapse, whether America enters the war or not. The Ottoman Empire is doomed by the end of 1917, one way or another. Austria-Hungary is in serious trouble. Bulgaria in serious trouble. So I think it leads to a longer war, a bloodier war. I think there's a lot more voices raised about about possible peace deals. And I think when the war does end in 1919, I think it might end in a messy way. Perhaps the Germans still occupying very large portions of France and Belgium, perhaps not crushed on the battlefield as they were. Perhaps an internal revolution actually sparks off, a Bolshevik revolution in Berlin. So it's the home front that collapses instead. So I think the Allies win, but I think it's really difficult, and I think it's messy as well. But listeners, I'd love to know what you think. And Dan, I'd love to know what you think. Do you think no submarine warfare? One, does it keep the Americans out? And two, the Americans are out. Do the Allies win?
Yeah, both good questions. And I think the first one, I think I can answer. I think in a fairly straightforward way. I believe if unrestricted submarine warfare is not reintroduced, or perhaps not introduced in the first place, I think America stays out of the war. I think I could be pretty sure about that. Yes, America by that time, as we previously discussed, is, if anything, pro-Western Ally, pro-British, pro-French. Of course, having very close connections with the French specifically. But also, you've got to bear in mind, America has a huge German population. In fact, the largest immigrant population in the 50 years before the outbreak of the First War is going to be from Germany in that part of the world. So there are a lot of people in the US who aren't necessarily, head over heels with the idea of going to war with Germany in the first place. And without a smoking gun of the kind that unrestricted submarine warfare delivers, I just think America looks at the opportunity, says, look, the old world's tearing itself to pieces. We can stay on the sidelines. We can, in fact, probably do quite well from a financial point of view for this. Why do we need to go over there? Without a direct provocation, maybe the Zimmerman telegram is part of that, but it's certainly not enough to send America into the war on its own. And maybe with no unrestricted submarine warfare, maybe that telegram never even appears. So lots of different possibilities. Now, the second question I think is certainly more complex. If America does join the war, do the Allies still win it? This is a tricky question, and it's one that is often and hotly debated. And I know we've covered fairly recently ourselves. It's just such a difficult situation to push. I think one of the first things to mention here is, do the Germans launch a spring offensive in the same way that we see in 1918? Because Germany, in effect, puts a countdown on its own schedule to fight the war by bringing the Americans into the war. And as a result, we have to get a spring offensive. Now, let's say America doesn't join the war. Do we still get a major German offensive in 1918? I think we probably do, but I don't think it's going to be rushed in the same way that the spring offensive that we see is fought. It may be fought with much larger resources. It may have had better planning, and it may have had more success. In that situation, if the Germans manage to break through and split the if the Germans manage to break through and split the French and the Brits, does one of those powers get knocked out? It's not out of the question, actually. In fact, that kind of brings us on to my next question for you, counterfactual. Let's go back to the spring offensive, 21st of March 1918. The Germans are going to roll the dice in a really big way. Let's say that they get through, and Amiens, the city, really the linchpin behind the Allied lines, in between the British and the French, does get captured in that opening week. How much of a change is that for you?
That's a huge change. And just to expand that out, so we did cover this in Spring Offensive Episode 1. British Fifth Army down on the Somme, very, very stretched, 42-mile front, can't cover it properly. Germans hit it very, very hard on the 21st of March. If you include prisoners, it's the costliest day of the war for the British Army. Huge numbers of men lost, perhaps as many as 70 or 75,000. Numbers a little bit disputed. And the other thing that the Germans want to do there is they want to splinter that army. They want to shatter it if they can. And they come pretty close. It's dealt a huge blow. And then Fifth Army does manage to make this fighting retreat. Very hard fighting, very confused. We've covered it in depth in episode 6, if my memory serves me correct. Now, what happens, though, if that army fragments and it starts to break up, which is there's a real possibility of that, even though the Germans are under huge pressure trying to keep up as well. But let's say Fifth Army just breaks down, discipline collapses, the army fragments and scatters, dissolves, fades away in the terminology of the British of the First World War, and the Germans get into Amiens. Now, it's a long way, and the British would have certainly fought at the gates of Amiens, but even if, let's just say there's such a collapse, the Germans do get in, or the alternative, the Germans get to Amiens and they immediately understand its importance. They cut the rail lines. They don't necessarily have to capture the city itself, though they'd like to. Cut the rail lines, bombard the city, wreck the marshalling yards, and knock out Amiens. This would have been absolutely disastrous for British logistics in the Somme region. And in fact, the British had been planning a sort of absolute nightmare scenario. What happens if we lose Amiens? We're in serious trouble. Effectively, logistically, the British can't sustain operations in that part of the front for the foreseeable. You'd have to reorganize the entire front. It would be incredibly difficult. And what that means, I think, is that the front around Amiens, let's say the Germans have captured it, would be very, very porous. The French would have had to try and block it in. But it would have given the Germans an enormous advantage. There'd have been so many troops drawn down to Amiens because it would need to be retaken. That line would need to be reopened. That I think that in turn opens up, in some ways, the jugular vein of the British, and that's Hasbrouck, which is on the Ypres front, which is the other great logistics base for the British. And Hasbrouck, in some ways, even more important because all the Channel ports traffic passes through Hasbrouck on its way to Amiens, in fact. If you have both Amiens and Hasbrouck captured, well, next stop, in some ways, the ports. That's where the British would fall back in that direction because that is shortening their logistic train. So I think if Amiens goes, it unhinges everything in the Somme sector and in the Arras sector. You'd have created a really, really dangerous situation, not merely for Fifth Army, but for Third Army to the north. I think it's an absolute military disaster. And that is going to completely alter Ludendorff's calculations as well. It's going to open up the Ypres front much more, and he might have well have achieved what he wanted to achieve. I think if he got both of them, I think the British would have had no choice but to fall back in the direction of the ports. And this wasn't a sort of cowardly act or a perfidious act. It was an act of logistical realism. You cannot supply these incredibly resource-hungry armies unless you have some form of logistics hub. And with those two rail centres gone, the only options left are the ports. So you'd have had a major withdrawal, really south of Ypres, I think, to try and shorten those supply lines. And the Western Front does become somewhat mobile in 1918. I think that would have become very mobile. Who knows where that would have gone, because it would have forced the British north towards the ports, and it would have opened up the French, which was ultimately the Germans' long-term ambition, to a really devastating blow as well. And even if the British didn't retreat too far, the logistics choke means that they wouldn't be in a position to launch much in the way of major offensives. They'd effectively be out of the game until they restored their logistics. And that leaves the French in a very vulnerable position. So I think this is... Would it have been enough to turn the war in the Germans' favour? Possibly. Although with millions of Americans arriving, difficult to see it in the long term. But, wow. That's the big what if for 1918 for me, and I think it could well have tipped the war in Germany's favour. But what do you think, Dan?
Well, interestingly, Spence, I think we've actually got, a lot of these we're kind of throwing ideas about and speculating. I don't think we need to speculate too much with this one, because actually we've got a kind of a blueprint for what happens if those kind of movements take place. And you can find it in May of 1940. Because it's actually that same area, the Somme Valley, where the Germans have broken through after the assault in the west with Blitzkrieg and broken through at Sedan. They've actually advanced down the Somme Valley, and they've done exactly what we've just described. They've split the British and the French by racing to the coast, grabbing the town of Abbeville, bypassing Amiens, and basically trapping the Brits and French First Army, we should add, to the north in what then becomes the Dunkirk pocket, whilst threatening the French to the south, who naturally are going to do what we always expect, which is to withdraw to screen Paris. And in effect, you're splitting both the British and the French allies. And we see this in 1940, and we see what the effect is. And I believe that the Brits would probably do something not dissimilar to what they do in 1940. They're going to have to fall back on their ports. The Germans are going to start rolling up their flank, probably capture Boulogne, maybe squeeze up as far as Calais. That might even only leave Dunkirk and perhaps the town of Newport, which is right up in the Belgian sector on the northern part. Maybe we see Dunkirk 1918, just possibly. That's a pretty, it's a pretty high stakes thing. What we need to also remember, though, is the Americans are still coming into the war. Whether they stop if Britain gets knocked out, I don't think they do. I think they're coming for the French more than they are for the Brits. And what we might start seeing is American troops, rather than feeding into the area that we've been describing, feeding in much further south where they end up down in Saint-Nazaire, and then propping up the French army from that side. So is the war over? Maybe for the Brits, but maybe not for the rest of the Allies. I don't know. Any thoughts on that bit?
I think just to add to this, listeners, if you're thinking, well, this sounds a bit far-fetched, Dunkirk 1918, let's not forget that Douglas Haig actually orders his staff to start drawing up plans for an evacuation, for falling back onto the ports. That's the level of danger if these logistics hubs get pinched out. And so this is not the British are seriously considering this. This is a contingency they have to consider. It's also one they don't tell the French about. It has to be said. They don't want the French to know that the British are thinking about falling back on the ports and possibly having to evacuate there. Now, just to add a little bit to this, Haig sees this evacuation as evacuating and then coming back somewhere else, possibly using the American logistical hubs, which are actually on the Atlantic coast instead, or finding another route. But that's going to take a really, really, really long time. Really long time. And crucially, if the British are forced back onto the ports, they're ineffective. They can't really do anything. The Germans can screen them off while the British are trying to work out their logistics. Opens up opportunity to really smash the French if they can do it. I think your point about the Americans is an interesting one. You'd see lots more American divisions in defensive fighting, perhaps taking the role of the British north of the Somme and so forth. As we've seen in our survey of the Americans do well in defensive fighting, the Rock of the Marne and so on, but are they able to then transition into a really effective counterattack? I don't know. What I can say for sure is the Western Front would have looked really different. It would have been really swirling. It'd been very chaotic. Anything can happen. And the other thing I would add is that the morale boost for the Germans, knowing they'd really smashed the British back into the ports, would have been huge. One of the things that's really hurting the Germans by the summer of 18 is they keep dealing all these huge blows to the Allies, and long-term, nothing's happening. The Allies just keep fighting instead, whereas this would be an obvious and distinct victory. So I think it's probably the closest the Germans come on the battlefield to winning since 1914, which we started this podcast with. What happens if Le Cateau ends badly for the British? What happens if Ypres falls in 14 or 15? I think the next really big opportunity for the Germans on the battlefield is this. And the fascinating thing for me, Dan, is that Ludendorff, and indeed the German planners, never perceived the value of Amiens. Not until the very, very end of effectively the end of the campaign, do they perceive how important it is. They know Hasbrook's important, and they want that as an objective. But Amiens, it's only very late in the day they see the opportunity there. So in some ways, perhaps the what if Ludendorff wakes up one morning in January 1918 and says, we've got to take Amiens. We not just break through, we've got to take Amiens. There's another what if. And I think an interesting example of how individual generals making big decisions can have a huge effect that ultimately is influential on millions of people. So this is why counterfactual history is so fascinating.
Yeah, it is. And I suppose sticking with the theme of generals and generals making big statements and big decisions, I want to go back to good old John Pershing that we've been speaking about recently, and his famous phrase and wish, in fact, that towards the end of the 100 Days offensive, where America's really on the up, and the Brits are advancing, the French are advancing, even the Belgians up in the Ypres salient have burst through and are pushing the Germans back. Pershing wants to drive into Germany, wants to occupy, wants to put Allied boots on the ground in Germany, wants to show the Germans that they have been beaten. He wants to really nail home the idea that the Great War has been lost on the battlefields. And of course, we know with 11th of November 1918 is going to stop that. The armistice is going to come into effect, and Allied troops are not going to be in Germany. But what would have happened had we pursued Pershing's dream, and not Pershing alone, we should add, but Pershing's aim of advancing into Germany and really crushing the Germans on German soil? What do you think might have happened as a result of that?
Oh, well, historians, it's complicated card being played right away. I think, and we can see this in hindsight, I think as awful as it would have been, and it would have led to a lot more casualties, it would have led to an awful lot of hardship for German civilians. There'd have been German refugees on the road, destruction of villages and so on. I'm inclined to agree, given everything that happens after the First World War, given the way that German government and intelligentsia immediately create the idea that the German army is undefeated, I think you could have seen a very different 1920s and 1930s Germany. But I'm going to throw out a little twisty counterfactual here. So let's say the Allied armies do go across the Rhine in early 1919. The weather would have stopped them, I think, in winter 18. Weather improves early 1919. Germans make a last stand on the Rhine. They're not going to hold. They get swept over. Allies advance. There's going to be destruction of property. There's going to be refugees on the road. The German army is going to be crumbling and collapsing. What happens in Berlin? Because in Berlin, as we know historically, there's the Spartacist uprising, this attempted and botched Bolshevik uprising, with the army gone, the army collapsing, the German civil society in ruins as the Allies advance. You might have a situation where it's a case of, well, be careful what you wish for. We've crushed the German army so comprehensively, of course, so much chaos, that Germany is descending into a Bolshevik revolution, and the Allies have had to go all the way to Berlin, occupy Germany to really put this one to rest at the cost of vast amounts of casualties. It would have been bitter fighting all the way. That's one option. I think it might have been messier than we think. But the other option, let's say the German army is really badly hammered, and there's another alternative where this might happen. And that's in 1919, where when the Allies present the Treaty of Versailles to the German government's horrified, and they actually go to the army and say, listen, if we reject this, can you defend the borders of Germany? And the German army says, we can hold for about 2 weeks, and then the Allies are going to be in, and it's going to be horrible. And so the German government has to accept it. But let's say the German government says, no, we're going to do it. We're going to fight in summer 1919. There's some wild nationalists saying we'll do a levy en masse, we'll put women and children into the front line, we'll do everything we can to defend Germany. It wouldn't have worked. Allies are too strong. If you'd had that level of defeat too, and the German government then seen this, the German army smashed, I think you would have got a very different 1920s, but not necessarily a better 1920s. I think trouble would have emerged in Germany perhaps from different directions. We tend to forget how powerful the communists were in Germany, how much of a threat they were in Germany in the 20s and 30s. Perhaps the Allies had gone into Germany, really shown the German nation that you've been defeated. The renewal of Germany, dare I say it, or the revenge aspect of Germany wouldn't have been driven by the Nazis. It would have been driven by the communists instead. But we're getting way into counterfactuals there. But I think in the short term, I think it would have been a benefit, and perhaps in the long term too, because that stab in the back myth becomes so powerful, and it has such broad support across the German intelligentsia. It can't help but seep down into the public consciousness. And once you start to go, well, we were never defeated. Why are we accepting this punitive treaty when we weren't defeated? The army was still victorious. The navy was victorious. Then it's a very easy step to say, well, we weren't defeated. We should reclaim what we've lost. Whereas if you've seen clearly you've been defeated, your towns and cities are in ruins, your army is in prison cages, there's no way back from that. So I think, given what happens, of course, with the Second World War, I think if we could go in a time machine, Dan, we might well whisper in Foch's ear. You'd have to whisper it because you speak French. He wouldn't understand me with my pronunciation. Say you should really advance into Germany and really, really make clear what's happened here. But hindsight's a wonderful thing. But that's my view. What do you think? Do you think it have made a difference?
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly to my mind, it would have made a difference. But what the end result of that difference would have been is a tricky one. My own personal feelings on this, if you kind of boil it down as to the situations that allows either people on the extreme left or on the extreme right to take power, which I think is always going to be a recipe for major problems down the road, is basically instability. And instability could have been brought about in a couple of different ways. One of them is a really punitive Treaty of Versailles, which causes kind of internal upheaval over a longer period of time. Another one might have been literally Germany being crushed. So the difference, I think, here is in the strategy that the Allies adopt as a result of that. So do we see what we see in the First World War, which is Germany, and to an extent, is left to its own devices following the Treaty of Versailles? Got to pay the bills, got to do the stuff that we said, but you can still govern yourself in that general sense. Or is it what we see in the Second World War, where you get the Allies come in, the Americans, and they decide, okay, well, we're going to rebuild and reinstitute and reinitialize this stability, but it's going to be done under our watch. Now, if that second one happens in 1919, maybe there's a more stable Germany in the 20s. There's a more prosperous outlook for Germans in general. People don't tend to look very left or very right when things are going quite well. So just maybe 1919, Pershing, Americans come in, the French come in, and they're not super vindictive, as of course we know does happen later on. The Brits come in and they decide that they're going to invest in rebuilding German infrastructure and establishing a secure government, and they hang around for a while. just maybe we don't see a Second World War. Who knows? Big statement, big question. Of course, we know that isn't what happens. But stability, to my mind, is really the key to the story here. Do you agree on that one?
Oh, I think so. And got to have an opportunity here to just give a little plug to our sister podcast, Both Sides of the Wire, which is about the Second World War, because they've recently covered in an episode about the origins of the Second World War. And one thing that they really emphasize, which I certainly found interesting, I'm sure listeners will too, is the extent to which the build-up to the Second World War is about opportunism, especially German opportunism. Not really a master plan to start the Second World War, but instead seeing opportunities caused by the weakness of the former Allied powers to take back things and to provoke things instead. Whereas I think if the Germans had taken a real, either been invaded and occupied, or they had perhaps a better 1920s, that desire to sort of redress the balance is going to be very, very different. If you think about how much Nazi propaganda is based on, especially early Nazi propaganda, based on once we've shattered Versailles, everything's going to be better. If you could actually have a Germany that had either been, you've really seen you've been defeated, or there's a better Germany emerges in the 20s, then that message isn't so seductive, because ultimately to a lot of Germans, reclaiming the Sudetenland or taking the Danzig corridor is not hugely on their list of priorities. And you made a great point, Dan. People don't tend to look at the extremes of politics when things are going well. One of the reasons that what we might call centrist politics tends to dominate in the West is it sort of speaks for, well, I quite like how things are. Yes, I might want some things to change, but I'm quite content with what I've got and I don't want it disrupted. Whereas if you haven't got much and you're really furious, looking for extreme answers on the left and the right becomes a lot more appealing. And of course, tragically in Germany, so many people don't have what they want. They are suffering and they're looking for not a centrist tinkering around the edges. They want something dramatic. And that is, of course, the great failure of what had happened after the war, where you either had to have a very punitive approach to Germany and say, look, you've been smashed and by God, you're going to know about it. Or you had to have an all-out conciliatory approach and say, okay, you've lost, but we don't want you crippled. We want to see you become part of the European community again. Effectively what the Americans did with West Germany after World War I. And the tragedy of Versailles is it's a treaty that's harsh enough to really anger the Germans, but it's not punitive enough to ever stop the Germans recovering. And it doesn't have any enforcement mechanism to stop the Germans militarily recovering. So you get the worst of both worlds. You really, really enrage the German body politic, and you don't do enough to ensure that they'll never seek vengeance on you again. So it's, in that sense, it's not a great peace treaty, but we could talk about the Versailles Treaty for hours, Dan.
Indeed. But, this is really, I've actually really enjoyed this. This has given us a great opportunity to explore some of those what ifs of history. And of course, what's really interesting, Spence, it's you and I discussing on here, but I just love to hear from people who are listening to this right now. Give us your thoughts, because of course there are so many different possibilities and angles that we can approach here. Have we missed anything out in discussing these what ifs? Is there a really big one that actually we've missed out? And what are your thoughts on those kind of key moments that could, and perhaps even should in some cases, have changed history? So that brings us to the end of this slightly off the cuff and hopefully quite enjoyable foray into the world of what if, of the history of the First World War.
And just before we leave this really fascinating discussion, Dan, I have to make a mention, listeners, that if you're not aware of it, I co-authored a book of World War I what-if counterfactuals, which actually put you in charge and invite you to make some of the decisions that we've been discussing, plus many more. And the book's called The Armchair General, World War I, Can You Win the Great War? Written by myself, Spencer Jones, and my co-author, John Buckley. Available wherever good books are sold or available online. Makes for a great gift for a history lover, or perhaps you might enjoy reading it yourself and you get a chance to rewrite history by making the decisions and perhaps, just perhaps, winning the war much sooner than it really was.
Thanks for joining us, of course, and we'll see you again next week. You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon. Where Smith Dorian famously says, very well. Where Smith Dorian famously says, very well.